Mr. Adler, please, don't go. Nora's voice cracked as alarms blared through the hospital hallway. The frail man clutched a small envelope against his chest, his trembling hands stained with dried blood. He turned to her, his eyes wet with something far heavier than pain. You shouldn't have cared, Nora, he whispered. Then he pressed the envelope into her palm, the moment before security burst through the doors. That same night, his face appeared on the news under one chilling headline. Decorated war hero, presumed dead for 70 years. Before we begin, please like, subscribe and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Globe showing Europe, Africa, United States, Canada, UK, Australia, Jamaica. In the soft hum of midnight, the fluorescent lights of St. Anne's Hospital painted everything pale and tired. It was the kind of hour when even the coffee tasted lonely, and the only sound came from the steady rhythm of heart monitors echoing down the hall. For Nora Whitfield, this silence had become her second heartbeat. Night shifts had a way of swallowing time. The hours blurred into years, and life outside the hospital became something she occasionally remembered rather than lived. At 34, she had no children, no husband, and no one waiting for her when she clocked out at dawn. The only thing that met her at home was an aging cat named Mabel and the faint hum of the fridge that hadn't been cleaned in months. Nor didn't mind the solitude. After losing her father, a decorated army medic, she found comfort in caring for others, especially the ones who had no one else. But lately, even that comfort was starting to feel like a routine of endless faces, endless pain, and no lasting difference. Until the night she met Henry Adler. He was wheeled in just after midnight, frail, quiet, with bruises that didn't match his story. Fell in the shower, he'd said with a polite smile. His voice was low, measured, the kind of voice that sounded like it had seen too much. The other nurses treated him like any other patient, but something about him pulled at Nora's chest. Maybe it was the way he kept glancing at the window, as if looking for someone who never came. Or maybe it was the simple way he refused to eat, as though he didn't think he deserved to. His chart said no family, no emergency contact, no address beyond a P.O. box. He was a ghost of a man who somehow still breathed. The first time she offered him soup, he refused. Don't waste the hospital's food on me, he said quietly. But Nora left it by his bedside anyway. The next morning, the bowl was empty. And that became their unspoken routine. Every night, she'd bring him something small, soup, tea, half a sandwich. Sometimes, she'd stay for a few minutes and talk about nothing. Weather, baseball, the sound of rain. He'd listen quietly, offering only small nods or faint smiles. It wasn't much. But for Nora, it was the first time in years she felt seen, even if he never said her name out loud. Her co-workers began to notice. Another one of your lost causes? One nurse joked as she passed by. Nora only smiled, but the truth was, Henry Adler wasn't just another patient. He reminded her of her father. The quiet dignity, the stubbornness, the eyes that carried decades of untold stories. When she asked him about his past, he would deflect gently. Not much to tell, he'd say. Just a long life with too many yesterdays. But once, as she adjusted his blanket, she noticed the faint outline of an old military tattoo on his wrist, faded, almost invisible. She didn't ask about it, but she saw the way his fingers trembled whenever he touched it. Days turned into weeks. Henry was discharged, then readmitted, then vanished for nearly a month. No forwarding information, no next of kin. And when she thought she'd never see him again, he showed up one cold February night, limping, weaker, carrying an old leather satchel. Guess I missed the hospital food, he joked softly when she entered his room. But something was different this time. His color was worse, his breathing shallow, his eyes heavier. When she checked his vitals, he whispered, "You shouldn't keep checking on me, Nora. People might talk." She smiled sadly. Then let them talk. There was a pause. A long, heavy one. Then he said something that sent a quiet chill through her. "You remind me of someone I disappointed a long time ago." Before she could respond, his breathing steadied again, and his eyes closed. The next night, she found a folded piece of paper on his bedside table. It wasn't addressed to anyone, but the handwriting was careful, almost too neat. She didn't open it. Something told her it wasn't time yet. The hospital was quieter than usual that week. Most of the patients were asleep, and the nurses gathered near the break room watching reruns of old sitcoms to stay awake. Nora, however, found herself sitting alone in room 207, just listening to the sound of Henry's shallow breathing. It reminded her of her father's final days, the way silence could scream louder than words. She wondered who Henry really was. He never had visitors, yet carried himself like a man used to commanding attention. There was sadness in him, yes, but there was also discipline. A military kind of grace that didn't fit with the lonely drifter story he gave on his forms. Still, she didn't push. Some people didn't want to be found. That night, as she tucked the blanket around him one last time, he reached out weakly and said, "You're too kind for your own good." Nora smiled faintly. "Guess it's a bad habit." Sometimes, the world forgets the people who care in silence, the ones who stay a little longer, who notice the things others overlook. Nora didn't know it yet, but her kindness was about to uncover a truth that would shake an entire town. If stories like this remind you that compassion still matters, take a second to stay, not for me, but for every real-life Nora out there who gives without asking anything back. Nora had always believed that hospitals changed people. Some became softer, others harder. But Henry Adler, he stayed exactly the same. Quiet, measured, like a man who'd already lived 100 lives and didn't want another one. After his most recent return to St. Anne's, Nora noticed patterns she couldn't unsee. Henry would wake around 2 a.m., sit perfectly still for an hour, and then take slow, deliberate breaths as though keeping time with something only he could hear. One night, she found him tracing his finger across an invisible line on his blanket, over and over, whispering numbers under his breath. 47, 12, 3. She asked what they meant, but he looked at her with tired eyes. "Coordinates," he murmured. "Old habits." Then, after a pause, "Forget I said that." The next morning, when she came back on shift, his room was spotless. The blanket folded with military precision. The chair positioned exactly 2 feet from the window. Every nurse noticed it. None of them cared. But Nora couldn't shake the feeling that the old man's mind wasn't slipping, it was trained. There was more discipline in that hospital bed than in the entire ward combined. She began to spend her breaks with him. Not out of pity, but out of something harder to define, a kind of quiet loyalty. He had become her reason to keep coming back, the one patient who made the nights less hollow. On her nights off, she found herself thinking about him, wondering where he came from, why he had no family, how he survived alone. There were moments she wanted to ask, but she knew better. Some wounds spoke louder in silence. Then, one Thursday night, she entered room 207 and froze. Henry wasn't there. The bed was made. His bag was gone. His nameplate removed. Nora ran to the nurse's station. "Where's Mr. Adler?" The charge nurse looked up lazily. "He checked out." "Checked out?" Nora repeated. "By who?" "Didn't say. Some paperwork came through early this morning. Guy came in, picked him up, signed discharge forms, left." Nora frowned. "What guy?" "Older. So, didn't give a name." Her gut twisted. Henry didn't have visitors, ever. She asked to see the signature, but the form had been shredded. The system had logged the discharge, but there was no ID. No trail. And just like that, Henry Adler vanished. 4 days, she checked every ER in Boston's outskirts. She called shelters, nursing homes, even police departments, asking if anyone had admitted an elderly veteran. Nothing. It felt wrong. Not just his disappearance, but the silence surrounding it. It was like someone had erased him. 2 weeks later, Nora sat at her kitchen table, half asleep, when she heard the morning news murmuring in the background. A name caught her attention. Adler. She turned up the volume. Local authorities continue to investigate the remains found near Lake Grantham, believed to belong to Henry Adler, a retired engineer who disappeared 2 weeks ago after being discharged from St. Anne's Hospital. Nora's heart sank. But the anchor continued. Authorities now believe this may not be the same Henry Adler registered at the hospital. The identification appears to be false. False. Her hands trembled. She replayed the segment. The words didn't make sense. How could a man with no family, no address, and a lifetime of silence have a fake name? She barely slept that night. And when she returned to work, something inside her told her not to clock in right away. Instead, she went straight to room 207. The bed was empty, again. But on the windowsill, tucked behind the curtain, was something small and folded. A photograph. It was old, decades old, faded at the edges. A group of young soldiers standing in front of a bomber plane, their smiles wide and proud. And right in the middle stood Henry Adler. Only he wasn't old. He was maybe 20, in uniform, standing with his arm around a man wearing the same medic patch her father used to wear. Nora's throat tightened. She flipped the photo over. On the back, scrawled in faint handwriting, were the words, Operation Iron Meadow, 1951, we did what we had to. She froze. Her father had mentioned that operation once, in passing years ago. Classified, he'd said. A mission that went wrong. Was Henry there? Why was he still alive? The next few nights blurred into each other. She couldn't focus on her work. The photograph burned in her mind. Finally, unable to resist the pull of curiosity, she searched Operation Iron Meadow online. Most results were redacted reports. Black lines covering half the words. But one article caught her attention. A 1980s piece about a mission in East Germany that ended in tragedy. A special operations medic unit was ambushed. Only one man escaped. The survivor's name, Captain Henry Adler. But the report said he died months later in an explosion while rescuing civilians. Except he didn't. He'd been living under a false name. He'd been her patient. And no one knew. The next day, she arrived at work early. Half from habit, half from the storm of questions churning in her chest. When she walked into room 207 again, she nearly dropped the tray in her hands. He was there. Henry sat in the chair by the window, thinner than before, but alive. You're back, Nora said softly, trying to steady her breath. He smiled faintly. Guess they didn't want me after all. She wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but his expression silenced her. There was weariness there, not the kind that came from age, but the kind that came from decades of hiding. That night, as she adjusted his fore, she saw something she hadn't before, a small scar just under his collarbone. The shape was too precise to be accidental, surgical, deliberate. She'd seen it once in her father's field medical photos. A bullet extraction. She looked up at him. You were in the war. He didn't answer. She whispered again, Why fake your name? Henry stared at the window, eyes reflecting the hospital lights. Because the man I was doesn't deserve to be remembered. Then he turned his gaze toward her and said, barely above a whisper, But you remind me of what it felt like to be human again. Nora left the room trembling. Something inside her had shifted, fear, curiosity, compassion all tangled together. And though she didn't know it yet, that quiet act of kindness, those midnight visits, had just unlocked a story the world thought had been buried decades ago. The night everything unraveled began like any other, cold, quiet, and ordinary. The hospital hummed under the soft buzz of fluorescent lights, nurses whispering in hallways, monitors beeping steady heartbeats like metronomes. Nora had grown used to the rhythm of it all, the long silences, the smell of antiseptic, the weight of lives suspended between pain and recovery. But that night, something in the air felt heavier. When Nora walked into room 207, Henry was sitting up, fully dressed, staring at a folded newspaper he must have borrowed from the waiting area. His face was pale, not from illness but from something else. He didn't look at her when she entered. He just said quietly, It's time, Nora. For what? She asked, setting down the breakfast tray. To stop pretending, he murmured. They found me. Before she could respond, he pushed the newspaper toward her. On the front page was a photo, grainy but unmistakable, of Henry, much younger, standing in front of a military convoy. The headline above it read, Missing War Hero Confirmed Alive, FBI Reopens Investigation into Captain Henry Adler. Nora's stomach dropped. She scanned the article, her eyes catching on words like classified operation, faked death, civilian casualties, and stolen identity. The story claimed Henry Adler had vanished in 1956 after a covert mission went wrong. Official records listed him as killed in action, until a hospital blood test had matched his DNA with military files last week. Nora felt dizzy. The article mentioned St. Anne's by name. Her hospital. Her ward. Her patient. She looked at him, her voice barely a whisper. You knew they'd find you. He nodded. You can't run from ghosts forever. That night, the hospital erupted in chaos. Reporters swarmed the front entrance. The administrator fielded calls from government agencies. Every nurse was questioned. When they reached Nora, her palms were sweating. How long have you been in contact with Mr. Adler? Did he ever mention his past? Did you know he was using a false identity? She answered honestly, no, and no. But the suspicion lingered in their eyes. Afterward, she found Henry sitting quietly by the window again, the same stoic calm he always carried. You should tell them the truth, she said softly, before they twist it. He chuckled weakly. The truth, Nora? You think they'd believe it? Try me, she said. He looked at her for a long time, as if weighing whether she could handle what he was about to say. Then he exhaled. I wasn't supposed to survive that mission, he began. It was 1956. Cold War. We were sent to extract a scientist, a man defecting from East Germany. Everything went wrong. There was a trap. My men, they didn't make it. He swallowed hard, his eyes glassy. A shell hit a nearby village. Civilians were killed. I wasn't supposed to be there. The orders changed last minute. My call. Nora felt her chest tighten. I reported it as enemy fire, Henry continued. But I knew better. I couldn't live with it. So I walked away. Changed my name. Spent decades running from a uniform I no longer deserved to wear. He paused, the weight of 70 years pressing down on his trembling hands. I wasn't hiding from justice, Nora. I was hiding from myself. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The hospital noises faded into a blur of distant echoes. Finally, she whispered, You saved people after that, didn't you? The men who did survive. Henry shook his head. That doesn't wash blood away. Nora felt tears sting her eyes. Then why come back here? Why now? He smiled faintly, a sad, fragile smile. Because this is where I was born. And if I was going to die, I wanted to face the only country I ever loved, even if it didn't love me back. The next day, the media firestorm intensified. Headlines flooded every local station. Veterans posted tributes. Critics called him a deserter. Conspiracy theories spread like wildfire. By midnight, St. Anne's Hospital became a fortress. Federal agents in dark suits filled the lobby. Security locked down every exit. Nora stayed by Henry's side through it all. Not because she had to, but because leaving him felt like betrayal. At one point, an agent named Morris approached her. Ma'am, you understand harboring a fugitive is a federal offense? She looked at him calmly. He's not a fugitive. He's dying. Still, the man replied, we'll need to question you. That night, Henry's condition worsened. His pulse faltered. His breathing shallowed. Nora stayed with him past her shift, ignoring orders to leave. At around 2 a.m., Henry reached for her hand. His skin felt paper-thin, his grip trembling. They'll come for me soon, he whispered. But you, don't let them make me into something I'm not. Promise me that. I promise, she said, tears catching in her throat. He smiled faintly. Good. Then you should also know. He struggled for air, forcing the words out. There's a box. In my bag. It's for you. Don't open it until I'm gone. Nora nodded, though her chest ached. She wanted to tell him to rest, to fight, to stay, but something in his eyes told her it was already too late. Moments later, a knock echoed at the door. Federal agents, a voice called. Henry turned toward her, his voice barely a whisper now. I just wanted peace, Nora. That's all. She squeezed his hand. Then let me help you find it. When she opened the door, the agents entered briskly, badges raised. We need to speak with Captain Adler immediately. She turned back toward the bed, But Henry's eyes were closed, his breathing still. For a moment, the room froze. "Ma'am?" one agent asked. But Nora didn't answer. She stood there, tears silently rolling down her cheeks, realizing that whatever truth Henry had carried for 70 years had finally come to rest, right there, in that hospital bed. The next morning, every TV in the break room played the same story. Henry Adler, the long-lost war hero, passed away late last night under mysterious circumstances. Officials say he left behind personal belongings that may reveal classified information about Cold War missions previously thought destroyed. Nora sat alone in the corner, watching the screen. They spoke of him like a myth, a headline, a controversy. But she knew the truth. He wasn't a hero or a fugitive. He was just a man who'd carried the unbearable weight of remorse longer than anyone should. And as she reached into her pocket and felt the folded envelope he'd given her, she realized his story wasn't finished yet. The hospital was quieter than usual after Henry's passing, but the silence felt different now, heavier, like the walls themselves were mourning. Room 207 sat empty, the bed stripped, the window blinds half drawn as if holding its breath. The staff moved on quickly. Patients came, patients went. But for Nora Whitfield, time had stopped the moment Henry Adler's heart had. She couldn't bring herself to go home that morning. Instead, she sat in the staff locker room long after her shift ended, staring at the small worn satchel Henry had always kept by his bedside. She hadn't opened it yet. All she knew was that he'd said, "It's for you. Don't open it until I'm gone." Her fingers trembled as she unbuckled the strap. Inside, wrapped in an old military handkerchief, was a wooden box about the size of a book. The hinges were rusted, the top engraved faintly with initials, H. Underneath the box was a sealed envelope with her name written in careful, deliberate handwriting. Nora. The sight of it made her chest ache. She hadn't realized until then how much she'd come to care for him, not out of duty, but something quieter, deeper. He had reminded her of her father, proud, flawed, and carrying the kind of grief that had no language. She broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, but steady enough to be read. "If you're reading this, it means I've finally stopped running. I've had a long time to think about what makes a person worthy of forgiveness. For 70 years, I told myself I didn't deserve any. But then you showed up, with soup, a blanket, and no questions. You didn't see a ghost. You saw a man. You reminded me of the best kind of people I once served with, those who did what was right even when no one was watching. Inside the box is the truth, not the version written in history books. My truth. Do with it what you think is right. Whatever you choose, know this. You were the first person to make me feel human again. Henry Adler." Nora sat there, staring at the letter, the edges of the paper shaking in her hands. She wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. Finally, she unlatched the box. Inside were a few old items, a tarnished dog tag, a faded photo of a group of soldiers, a Medal of Valor, and a small, sealed cassette tape labeled in black ink. Iron Meadow, Debrief 1956. Her pulse quickened. The same operation her father had once whispered about. She hesitated for a long time before taking the cassette to the hospital's old archive room. The space was dusty and dimly lit, filled with forgotten equipment. She found an old player, wiped the dust from it, and slid the tape in. The tape crackled. Then a younger Henry's voice emerged, firm, disciplined, but shaken. "This is Captain Henry Adler. Mission Iron Meadow, Day 17. We were compromised. Orders were unclear. Civilian presence confirmed inside target zone. Command insisted we proceed. I disobeyed." The pause. A sharp breath. "They told us to eliminate the site. I couldn't. My refusal caused delay. The blast went off early. 6 soldiers gone. Civilians too. My fault." Static filled the room for several seconds. Then, quietly, Henry's voice returned. "They'll call it enemy fire. They'll call us heroes. But I know the truth. And I can't live under it. I won't let their lie bury those men again. If this recording is found, it belongs to the families. Tell them I'm sorry." The tape clicked to a stop. Nora just sat there, the air thick with the sound of her own heartbeat. He hadn't run to hide from justice. He'd run because the truth would have destroyed the people who ordered him to act. He carried their guilt to protect others. He'd lived and died as both a soldier and a penitent. The story everyone told was a lie, and now, the truth was in her hands. Later that afternoon, federal agents returned to the hospital to collect Henry's belongings. They asked about the satchel. Nora lied and said it had been misplaced during discharge. That night, she went home, placed the box on her kitchen table, and stared at it under the soft yellow light. The old clock on her wall ticked like a metronome for her thoughts. If she turned the tape over, if she handed it to the press, the world would finally know what really happened. But it would also destroy the legacy of men who never had a say in those orders. If she kept it secret, Henry's sacrifice would remain buried, just another casualty of the war no one talked about. She poured herself a glass of water, her reflection trembling on the surface. She could almost hear Henry's voice again. Do with it what you think is right. She wished he were there to tell her what that meant. Then she noticed something she hadn't before, a second note hidden beneath the lining of the box. It was addressed to the families of Iron Meadow. She opened it. It was a list of names, the fallen soldiers, their service numbers, and a final line at the bottom. They died with honor. I'm the one who didn't. That broke her. For the first time since he died, Nora sobbed, not for Henry's guilt, but for the unbearable loneliness of a man who had punished himself for a lifetime to protect others. The next morning, Nora drove to the Veterans Hall on the edge of town. She found the local commander, an older woman named Sergeant Delaney, who had served decades after Henry's time. I need to give you something, Nora said softly. Delaney opened the box, listened to the tape, read the letter, and cried. I remember my father talking about this mission, she whispered. We were told it was lost to time. Nora nodded. He wanted the families to know the truth. Not the military. Not the government. The families. Delaney promised to deliver it to the families privately, without media interference, ensuring that Henry's name would remain where it belonged, between those who understood. Before leaving, Delaney placed Henry's dog tag into Nora's hand. You earned this more than anyone, she said. That evening, Nora walked by the small park behind the hospital. The wind carried the smell of rain, and the flag near the Veterans Memorial waved softly in the breeze. She sat on a bench, clutching the dog tag. For the first time in years, she didn't feel empty. She felt seen, not as a nurse, not as a caretaker, but as someone who had helped another soul find peace. The world would never know Henry Adler's full story, but maybe that was the point. Maybe some truths were meant to rest quietly, just like the men who carried them. As the streetlights flickered on, Nora whispered into the dusk, Rest now, Henry. You made it home. Spring came slowly to Ashton, Illinois. The snow melted in streaks, revealing damp soil and tired grass, and the world began to look alive again. But for Nora Whitfield, the season carried a quiet ache. It had been 6 weeks since Henry Adler's passing, and not a day had gone by without her thinking about him. Room 207 was now occupied by a new patient, a young man recovering from a motorcycle accident, yet every time she passed that door, she could still hear Henry's voice. So, measured, tired. Sometimes, during the night shift, she'd glance toward that window and half expect to see him there, staring out at the moonlight with that same faraway look. The Veterans Hall kept their promise. Sergeant Delaney had quietly reached out to the families listed in Henry's letter. There were tears, forgiveness, and a small private service for the fallen men of Operation Iron Meadow. No media, no headlines, just candles, folded flags, and silence. Nora didn't attend the ceremony. She didn't need to. She'd already said goodbye in her own way. But one afternoon, while preparing to leave work, the hospital receptionist waved her over. Hey, Nora, package for you. She frowned. For me? Yep. No return address. It was a small, rectangular box, wrapped in plain brown paper and twine. The handwriting on the label stopped her cold. For Nora Whitfield. It was Henry's handwriting. Her heart began to race. She carried it home, hands trembling the whole way. At her kitchen table, she carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a folded American flag, a smaller velvet pouch, and a note. The note read, I asked a friend long ago to deliver this if he ever learned I'd passed. If you're reading it, it means he kept his word. This flag covered the casket of one of my men. I kept it all these years as a reminder of what I lost, and what I never made right. But you did something I couldn't. You faced the truth. You gave it peace. Inside the pouch, you'll find my service medal. I was told I earned it for bravery. I don't think I did. I want you to have it, not as a soldier's honor, but as a thank you from a man who finally stopped running. I once told you that you reminded me of someone I disappointed. That someone was my daughter. She died young. I never got to say I was proud of her. So I'll say it now, T. I'm proud of you, Nora. Henry. Her breath hitched, tears spilling before she could stop them. She opened the pouch. Inside was a single medal of honor, tarnished but beautiful in its quiet weight. She held it in her palm like it was glass, the light glinting off the edges. That night, Nora couldn't sleep. She placed the medal on her bedside table and just stared at it, remembering every small detail about Henry, the way he'd stir his tea 3 times before sipping, how his hands trembled when he buttoned his shirt, the faint hum he'd make when listening to old jazz. It wasn't grief she felt now. It was gratitude and understanding. Henry hadn't been seeking forgiveness. He'd been seeking connection. Someone who would see the man behind the uniform, the mistakes, the headlines. And somehow, she had been that person. A week later, Nora visited the local Veterans Memorial Park, the same one where Henry had once sat outside the hospital window watching the flag sway. The air smelled faintly of lilacs. The marble stones glistened under the early morning sun. She carried the folded flag under one arm and the medal in her coat pocket. At the far corner of the park, there was a new plaque added to the memorial wall. She approached it slowly, her throat tightening as she read the engraving. Captain Henry Adler, 1928 to 2025. He carried the truth so others could rest. Beneath it, smaller letters read, in honor of those who bear their burdens quietly. Nora knelt, placed the medal beneath his name, and unfolded the flag beside it. I think you finally made it home, she whispered. The wind shifted, catching the edge of the flag and lifting it gently, as though agreeing with her. For months after that, life slowly returned to its rhythm. Nora continued her night shifts. The same hallways, the same endless hum of machines. Yet something in her had changed. She found herself paying closer attention to the quiet patients, the ones who didn't ask for help but needed it most. She stayed a little longer by their bedsides, asked about their lives, brought them tea or soup, just like she used to with Henry. Her co-workers noticed. One evening as she left the break room, a young nurse named Mariah stopped her. You're always so calm, Nora. How do you do it? Nora smiled faintly. I just listen. Because she'd learned that listening was sometimes the most powerful medicine a person could offer. A few months later, a man in his 60s visited the hospital. He introduced himself as Alan Reeves, a retired colonel. I served under Captain Adler, he said softly. He mentioned you in a letter before he passed. Said you were the one who reminded him what decency looked like. He handed Nora a small bronze coin engraved with a simple phrase. For mercy, not judgment. It was Henry's phrase. His legacy. Nora held the coin tightly, her throat tightening. Thank you, she whispered. Reeves smiled. He wanted you to know he found peace. That night, when Nora left the hospital, she stopped by the park again. The air was crisp, stars bright against the dark sky. She stood by Henry's plaque, holding the coin in her hand. Guess we both made it through, old man, she said softly. A gentle breeze brushed against her face, and she swore she could almost hear his reply, not words, but a feeling. A quiet kind of peace. She smiled, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, and slipped the coin into her pocket. As she turned to leave, she noticed something pinned near the base of the memorial, a newspaper clipping laminated under glass. Nurse who cared for missing war hero honored for compassion. Her name was at the bottom. She hadn't wanted recognition, but seeing it there made her realize something simple and profound. Her story wasn't about fame or heroism. It was about humanity, the kind that still existed quietly, in corners of the world no one ever saw. Sometimes, the people we heal end up healing us in ways we never expect. Nora thought she was saving an old man from loneliness, but in truth, he was teaching her that compassion doesn't need witnesses to matter. Because kindness doesn't disappear, it echoes. And somewhere, someone always hears it. Thank you for watching to this very end. Please, like, share, comment, and most importantly, subscribe to this channel.